Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 304 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the new movie Ready Player One, based on the novel by Ernest Cline, who was our guest back in episode 158. And this will involve spoilers for everything in the movie and everything in the book, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by three guests. So first up, we've got Peter Rubin, who you may remember from our panel on Stranger Things back in episode 216. He's a senior editor at Wired, and he's also the author of the new book Future Presence, How Virtual Reality is Changing Human Connection, Intimacy, and the Limits of Ordinary Life. And you should all go check out his article, Ready Player One is a Virtually Empty Good Time, which is up now on Wired.com. So Peter, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Then next up, we've got Carol Pinchefsky, who you may remember from our panel on Arrival back in episode 230, and it's our panel on Ghostbusters back in episode 213. She's a writer for Blaster and Geek and Sundry, and has also been a writer for Forbes and Mac Life. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Playboy.com, PC Gamer, and Lightspeed Magazine, and she's also interviewed celebrities such as Neil Gaiman, Matt Smith, Daniel Craig, and Lucy Lawless. So Carol, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And also joining us today is Kent Bai, host of the Voices of VR podcast, for which he's interviewed over 850 VR pioneers, developers, and academics, with the goal of capturing an oral history of the VR medium, documenting the evolution of immersive storytelling, and facilitating conversations in the VR community. He's also currently working on a book titled The Ultimate Potential of VR. So Kent, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so Ready Player One presents this world where people spend most of their time in virtual reality. So let's start off with Peter and have you just tell us, what did you think of the way that VR was portrayed in the movie?
In the movie, I think the kind of lasting impression that I came away with was something that had sounded so fantastical in the book now feels like something that is a lot closer than 2045. I mean, we'll get into this, but there are multi-user social VR experiences all over the place that haven't reached the scale of the OASIS, but are certainly using the OASIS as, in many cases, an inspiration. So my other kind of takeaway is that the OASIS, at least as it was portrayed in the movie, we only saw kind of this very small subset as people chose to use it. We got an overview in the beginning, and we know that people can use it for shopping and for socializing and for extramarital affairs, even as Wade alludes to. But what we saw was, in my mind, a very limited application of the OASIS, and that is a multiplayer gaming one. Which is not to say that that's not a noble pursuit, but it certainly threw away all these other applications of virtual reality, all these other visions of virtual reality in purpose of, or rather in service of, I think, catering to this sort of fanboy gamer fantasy.
Well, let me tell you about, I just read the book, and this line sort of seems like science fiction to me. It says, "The visor drew the OASIS directly onto my retinas. At the highest frame rate and resolution perceptible to the human eye, the real world looked washed out and blurry by comparison." Is that?
Yeah, so if you look at the Magic Leap and the digital light field that is like the virtual retinal displays that Tom Furness first created in the 90s, that is now actually technology that's out there. We haven't seen it yet. A lot of people haven't seen it yet, but it is possible to literally paint photons directly onto the eyeball. So that technology exists, but most of the technology that's out there right now is using these LCD screens, and there's various issues with that. It's not giving you that same depth perception that you would get if you were actually looking at things in the real world. But there's things like digital light field walls and displays that are coming that are going to be more mimicking the holodeck. So my take is that, the Ready Player One, the book, came out in 2011, and it was really prescient in terms of describing a world that was just about to emerge with the Oculus Rift. And it's kind of an interesting case of sci-fi being an inspiration to a lot of the people who are actually creating this technology. And I agree with Peter in the sense that the technology that's represented in the film is actually closer to today's technology than I think what it's going to look like in 2045, which is going to be a lot less of this putting the visor over your face and completely occluding yourself. And I think by that time, we're going to have these augmented reality head-mounted displays that you're going to be able to seamlessly go between AR and VR. And, you know, the way that VR is depicted, everybody's sort of walking around with visors, occluding their eyes from connecting to other people. I don't expect that that's going to happen. I expect that in public, we're going to use AR, and in private, we're going to be able to use VR, but it's in those private contexts that we're going to have these vast social spaces. And so I think the vision and the story that's being told is something that is a continuation of the metaverse, but, you know, there's a lot of different variations of how I think it's going to be differing how it actually plays out.
I agree with Kent when he says that there's going to be a combination of AR and VR because, as we've seen from Google Glass, not a lot of people in America, at least, are willing to accept the idea that they could be recorded at any given moment. I think that's part of the pushback against Google Glass, the fact that it's kind of a privacy invasion.
Let me just explain, in case anyone doesn't know, that AR is augmented reality. So you're seeing still what's in front of your face, and you're seeing digital stuff on top, you know, superimposed on your field of vision. And then virtual VR is virtual reality. So it's completely what you're seeing is a completely digital virtual environment.
I also own an HTC Vive, and there still hasn't come a time where I think, oh wow, I really am in the HTC Vive world. I mean, it feels very real. I get a good perception of depth, but I just don't actually feel like I'm in a completely different world. When I take off the headset, it's kind of this great little, you know, whoa, where am I transition that I have to make. But I don't actually feel like it's going to replace reality at this point.
Well, right. One reason, Carol, I wanted you on the show is because you're the only person I know in New York who has an actual VR setup in your apartment. So I think that's
tiny apartment too.
Well, so now you can escape the confines of your tiny apartment and explore the entire metaverse, right?
Right. Uh-huh. Well, actually, I explored the metaverse of the OASIS because there is a virtual reality, there are game downloads you can download right now on Steam VR for the OASIS.
Yeah, there's a suite of experiences that different companies made in conjunction with HTC as kind of an ancillary marketing campaign for the movie. So there's an avatar creator and a social space called the Wave VR created a reconstruction of the distracted globe, which is the disco in the movie. And so there are kind of, I don't remember the exact number, but then a couple of wave shooters and things like that. So there's this kind of suite of small experiences that are available through Steam for people to kind of get a taste of the movie.
It was kind of a small experience, actually, because I only encountered one other person. I mean, it was a lot of fun exploring the world, but it wasn't a virtual world. It was more, you're right, an experience.
I want to just hop in and say that the vision of the OASIS is actually a lot more expansive as depicted in the novel as it is as depicted in the movie. In the beginning of the novel, there's a lot of descriptions of how the OASIS is like, there's all this free content. It's how you do education. It's how you work. It's how you play. It's basically like the open source version of the metaverse. However, in order to actually transport and teleport around, you have to pay money. And so in the vision of the book of Ready Player One, this OASIS is kind of like this essence of free culture and open source mentality. But I'd say that like there's this tension between the centralization and decentralization that's playing out within both the movie and the film, whereby there's a centralized force that is controlling everything, and that it's like, how are these individuals going to be able to then maintain their agency, essentially? Like, is there going to be a company that's going to be essentially controlling everything in the metaverse, or are there going to be enough people who are going to actually build out what I imagine is going to be a decentralized open web metaverse? And so that's part of the story that I've been covering on the Voices of VR podcast. And it's funny that in some ways the Oculus was inspired by the vision of creating this visor, but very soon it was essentially sold off to what would be equivalent to like the IOI in the movie, which was Facebook. Who wants to sort of sell ads and mine this technology for our private data. So there's a little bit of a very early split from the mythology that's told in the story of Ready Player One and how it actually played out.
Well, yeah, so let's set that up. So the story is set in the year 2044 or so, and it's this dystopian future where everything sucks, and a lot of people are forced to live in these. They're called the stacks. It's these sort of these vertical trailer parks because they're cramming so many people into these environments, and so because life is so unpleasant, there's a huge motivation for people to escape into VR, into this OASIS simulation where you can basically do anything that you can imagine. And as Kent was alluding to, there's this sinister corporation called IOI, which is trying to gain control over the over the OASIS. Peter, what do you think about IOI as a Wired writer?
Kent raises a couple of good points, and chief among those is this kind of tension between companies that are inspired by the OASIS itself and trying to build something that realizes that promise, and the fact that by its nature in the book, it is kind of, it's owned by someone, but it's this kind of, at this point, benevolent specter, not really a person. And so it kind of comes without these corporate constraints. And certainly in the movie, IOI gets a very easy dystopian read, and Nolan Sorrento, who's played by Ben Mendelsohn, who's the head of IOI, is really kind of this great, oily, swaggering caricature of profit-minded tech mogul. Obviously, right now, we see this with degrees of oiliness. We see this thing playing out all over the place. For not the least of which is Oculus's owner, Facebook. And so, what happens to our data? What the use of a VR user / consumer is to the company that owns the metaverse or owns a metaverse style experience is a question that, as Ken points out, is being grappled with now. And so, I actually wrote an essay about this in our March issue, which is the fact that the metaverse as it's developing now, before you take kind of open web standards into account, is kind of rather more like a series of puddles. And all of these are kind of these walled experiences with their own aesthetics and their own limitations. And the question is, what is it going to take, whether by coalition or by open standard shift in the paradigm through which we experience virtual and augmented reality, is kind of getting over those walls into each other. So a number of the kind of nascent social VR experiences / mini metaverses are kind of seeking to do that through a combination of deep linking and persistent avatar and persistent decentralized identity that you can kind of move from world to world.
Let me ask you, I have one other sort of technical question here. So there's a line in the book where it says, the OASIS utilized a new kind of fault-tolerant server array that could draw additional processing power from every computer connected to it. At the time of its initial launch, the OASIS could handle up to 5 million simultaneous users with no discernible latency and no chance of a system crash. Is that science fiction or is that coming?
That's already...
It's an educated projection, but I'll let Ken take this one, please.
So I think that if you look at the decentralized future of where things are going in terms of something like Filecoin, for example, where you would be able to mine cryptocurrency by being able to distribute and host files in a distributed fashion, that's essentially what High Fidelity has been building since the very beginning. And High Fidelity is trying to do this blend of part open, part centralized in different ways. They're the only virtual world to release their own cryptocurrency, the High Fidelity coin, and they're trying to architect it with the vision of this decentralized future. The founder of High Fidelity is Philip Rosedale of Second Life. So he took at all the different lessons that he learned from Second Life, and he's like, let's do this in a much more decentralized fashion. It's something that's, I think, is going to take a lot longer, but the big challenge is how do you actually get all these different concurrent users into the same instance at the same time? And at this point, the most that most people have been able to do is anywhere from 50 or 100. And that's still if you're able to kind of split apart all the different aspects of the avatar, the sound, the spatialization, the rendering. You can break up those different parts, and there are those decentralized approaches that are happening. But the goal of having 5 million people in a single instance is just like, it's mind blowing to even imagine actually being able to achieve that, because at this point we can only really achieve 40 or 50, maybe up to 100 if you do a lot of really decentralized architecture.
That's interesting. So, I mean, Carol, so I saw on Twitter you said that you reread the book specifically to prepare for this panel.
Yes, I did.
I really appreciate that. That's pretty hardcore. I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was due for a reread anyway. I mean, I really do love this book. I mean, it's a book about how knowledge of obscure geek literature saves the world. Like, how could I not love this?
So was it different? Did you notice new things rereading it? Was it different?
Well, I spent most of my reread comparing it to the film. But the essentials are the same, you know, geeky references, just coming at you fast and furious. And it just makes me smile every time I read these references, and they're very obscure and I get them. And I mean, that's what I love about geek culture in general. It's not so much a culture as a really tiny subculture that's just exploded. And this kind of, codifies what I love about geek culture, just obscurity.
Well, yeah, so the premise of both the book and the movie is that we've mentioned that there's this OASIS VR world that was created by a wealthy, you know, tech mogul and his friend Simon Pegg. And they he died, the creator.
Ogden Morrow.
And I guess you got to be, since like Will Wheaton and you know, people like that actually appear in the book as themselves, sort of. I guess you got to be, the Simon Pegg appears as a character in the movie. He does not appear as Simon Pegg. But yeah, so the creator created this amazing VR world that pretty much everyone takes refuge in. And he, when he died, he said that he established this sort of like treasure hunt of clues. And he said that whoever was the first to finish it would inherit his whole business empire, which is incredibly powerful. And so this evil corporation, IOI, is trying to do it so that they can monetize it and all sorts of bad stuff. I don't know, Carol, anything else I should mention here about just the basic setup of the story?
Well, that's definitely the premise of both, but the book really goes into the nitty-gritty of the dystopian quality of the world that they're living in. Our hero wants to go to school in the OASIS because to go to school in real world meant he's risking getting beaten up and bullied every single day and going through this dangerous neighborhood just to get to school. So the world is in more disarray in the book. I get a real sense of pain that I don't get from the movie.
Yeah, that was very appealing, the idea in the book that they can enforce standards of decorum in school if it's in virtual reality,
Right.
That would be nice.
Yeah. But it's not just decorum. I mean, it's a safe place for people. Yeah. The OASIS is actually a safe space.
Yeah. How about Peter? Are there any differences between the book and movie that kind of jump out at you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I had an interesting experience with the book when I kind of revisited it. I read it when it came out, and I think like so many people, I was captivated by the fact that someone had written this kind of loving elegy to the culture of like my formative years, everything from Atari games to Zemeckis movies and what have you. When I went back and reread it, I got this. I admit that I got the same. It wasn't on the level of when I went back and reread some Piers Anthony fiction that I loved when I was a kid, but I had a similar experience in that I thought I missed a lot of the stuff that I found now to be a little cringy. Everything from kind of the way Wade can't stop shoehorning incredibly clunky references into everything he says, and the way that he kind of views other people, especially women, where their identification with the thing that he loves kind of humanizes them in his eyes. And so I was really pleased that the screenplay adaptation stripped away a lot of that inner monologue. There was still a little bit. It was mostly used for explication. And a lot of those kind of reference offs got distilled into just a couple of exchanges, one between Wade and or Parzival and Artemis, and then a little bit between Parzival and H in the movie. That being said, though, I still think that there was this sort of this sort of same instinct to reduce people to the things that they loved in the past. And it kind of precludes the idea of growth in a larger way. I just, there's something about this kind of frozen in amber valorization of 80s geek culture that, while I'm steeped in it and grew from it, it feels kind of limiting.
Well, so when you're talking about Parzival and Artemis, do you want to just kind of run us through who are the characters, Peter?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the real world, you have, the movie's protagonist and the book's protagonist as well is a kid named Wade Watts, just a teenager. He's still in high school in the book, though school doesn't really come into play in the movie. And in the Oasis, his avatar, or his persona and his avatar are both named Parzival, after the kind of the knight of Arthurian lore who was going after the Holy Grail. And of course, the Holy Grail for Wade is this Easter egg that James Halliday, co-founder of Gregarious Games, is hidden somewhere in the Oasis. His best friend in the Oasis is in Avatar version is another kid or person who we only know as H, who's kind of like a steampunk ogre cyborg type of situation.
Yeah, it's a good description.
Kind of a mashup of a bunch of different kind of aesthetics mashed together. In real life, well, I don't know. You said we were going to spoil everything. So in real life, H turns out to be played by Lena Waithe, who's a young woman named Helen. And then the other kind of chief rival at the beginning in questing for the egg is an avatar named Artemis, a young woman who is kind of incredibly respected in the world of gunters or egg hunters, which is the culture of people who are always looking for ways to crack the clues and get to the egg. So Wade meets Artemis at one of the regularly scheduled races that is supposed to get you to the first key to really start the quest for the egg. In real life, of course, the question is Artemis who she seems to be? And so you get to these questions of identity and authentication and verified identities, which is a real thing. And as H says at one point in the movie, dude, she could be a 300-pound dude living in his mom's basement named Chuck. Of course, this is a movie, and a Spielberg movie at that. So Artemis, as a person, turns out to be every bit as live and beautiful and intimidating and cool as her avatar. At no point do we ever really have to plumb the tension between who we are in real life and who we allow ourselves to be. There's a little bit of that hinted at with H, who turns out to be Helen. You have you get into the idea of plasticity of identity, and a young black woman on the outside can be this kind of raceless, fearsome warrior on the inside. And that, just by getting at that, Ernest Cline kind of let that stand as the promise of a VR metaverse, and Spielberg does the same thing. He just kind of lets it sit there and trusts you to kind of take the tiny lesson from that. But there's so much more at play here, and there are so many avatars that who play pivotal roles in the movie Ready Player One, but you never get to know on the outside. There's this mercenary named IROC, and you never get to figure out who they are, which for me would be a perfect example of a way that an adapted screenplay could have fleshed out some of the holes in the book just a little bit.
Well, that character IROC, I thought, was one of the highlights of the movie. I thought he was so much fun, and he's basically
absolutely
not in the book pretty much at all. They really created that character in the screenplay.
Mm-hmm. And he was voiced by T.J. Miller, and certainly was, at least in the two theaters that I saw the movie in, was for a lot of people, certainly the comic relief highlight of the movie, and for a lot of people, kind of stole the show.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned this race at the beginning, which is this incredibly dangerous sort of Hot Wheels kind of race. And one of the first sort of difficulties I had with the movie is that it's established that there's permadeath in this simulation, that if your character dies, you go back, you lose all your experience and money and items and things. And I just had a hard time believing that a massively popular simulation like this would function in that way. It seems like that's a hardcore gamer, very niche sort of interest.
there's also the fact that people keep doing this race, and Wade is always broke, so he's scrounging coins at the back. But then you have people like H, who through multiplayer gaming have all this experience points. So, but we also know this isn't the first time this race has been held. So do people just perma-die again and again and again, build themselves back up in time for the next race? It felt like something that was kind of left out there with a bunch of strings dangling from it.
Yeah, that didn't make sense to me because, I mean, as every gamer knows, if something doesn't work, you try it a different way. If you can't go forward, go back. If you can't go back, go up, down, to the side. You know, that struck me as being not well realized.
I think there's a couple of things that are interesting here. One is that the book Ready Player One actually really focuses like solely on the 80s and really does this huge deep dive into everything into the 80s. And in the movie, they made the, I think, more marketing decision to kind of diffuse out all of this culture to be inclusive of all cultures from like, you know, different periods of time. So rather than just focus on one specific era, you just kind of have more of a meaningless mashup of all this different culture, which I think is going to happen. But a lot of the actual challenges that were featured in the book had like these deep puzzle-like qualities that were more an individual going in and doing this. And I think there's a couple of things that the movie did that was different. First of all, they were clanning up a lot sooner than they did in the book. Like, I think most of the challenges were singular player, whereas, you know, there was a single dimension, but they were collaborating a lot more earlier. And I think at the end, once everybody as a clan wins it, I think, you know, that's sort of left up to, you know, like it's sort of like the single player that was winning. And I would say that like virtual reality as a medium is really focusing on a number of different types of presence. There's active presence and social and mental presence. That's really making choices and taking action that we've seen in video games. But there's also a much more inner embodied, sort of a type of presence that's more about your own sense of presence. And it's not something that's very cinematic. So I think there was a little bit more of those types of cinematic experiences. Like, for example, I think one of the first challenges was Wade is actually embodying, or Parsifal gets to embody one of the characters in War Games and has to basically become a character within the movie. And those types of like immersive theater types of conceits, I think, you know, this book, Ready Player One, actually came out the same year that Sleep No More was released in New York City. And so it was a little prescient into this moving into immersive theater where you now get to either walk around and express your agency by moving around. But in the actual book, you actually become a character. And I think that type of living story or story living is something that I think we are going to continue to see. But I suspect that the real magic of VR actually isn't cinematic at all. Like the most beautiful experiences that I've had within VR would be extremely boring for other people to watch me have those experiences. It'd be almost like the equivalent of watching someone else meditate. So my take is that, you know, Ready Player One was written as this vision of a lot of these things of like, this would be amazing to be able to go do in a virtual experience, when in actuality, there's a lot of the constraints of the actual technology that prevent you from actually locomoting and doing all these things that you would want to do. And so there's a vision of what people think would be interesting in VR, but the reality is I think there's going to be a lot new affordances, or it's going to take a long time before we actually are able to live into a lot of the potential of what Ready Player One is showing.
What did you think, Ken, about, for example, the scene where they're dancing in 0G and they're spinning all around and upside down, or they're fighting and they're like doing backflips and kicks in the air and stuff? Are there rigs that are ever going to allow you to move that way and interact with VR to that extent?
So in terms of doing zero gravity stuff, I think that, you know, like there are going to be things like even NASA, for example, in order to train astronauts, they have these huge rigs in order to simulate low gravity situations. But this is where you start to get into location-based entertainment, where in order to get the high fidelity haptic experience, you have to be in machines that are actually giving you a little bit of that embodied experience. And so there's going to be limits by which that you're going to be able to really feel the haptics of that. But there's different things like the omnidirectional treadmills. That's something that, you know, was actually kind of lifted directly from technology that exists in the real world. I remember trying out George Berger's Infinitec at the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference 2014, and that is what they modeled the omnidirectional treadmill around. And there are haptic gloves that are out there to be able to start to simulate the haptics, and Haptex is probably the best one that I've seen. in order to do a haptic suit, you actually do literally have to like cover your entire body, and you're basically cutting your body off from the real world. And so it's still yet to be seen whether or not we'll start to develop those haptic suits, or if we'll start to move towards these more mixed reality situations where in order for you to really get those haptics and the taste and the touch and the smell and everything, that you actually have to be physically co-present to some of those things.
Well, you mentioned these things where in the book where the character has to go through the whole movie and quote every line from the movie. It's called flick syncs in the book, and I'm actually surprised that something like that doesn't exist already. It seems like you could just be watching the movie and it would just pause and the next player has to say the line or something. I mean, Carol, like it sounds like something you would be like. You would host a party, right, where we played a game like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But nothing like that exists that anyone knows of.
I feel like it does. There are definitely movie quote games, but I can't remember the name of it, but there was definitely one that was kind of clip-based, where they would show a sequence and then you'd have to finish it.
But I think that if you look at the future of immersive storytelling, that's not actually where things are going in terms of you just sort of mimicking from your recall what had already happened and you just sort of playing it out. What's more likely, and what I'm already seeing that's happening, is this trend in immersive theater that's much more akin to something like Westworld, where there may be some non-player character, artificial intelligent agents, or maybe there'll be a live immersive theater with live actors who you actually get to engage with and express your agency. And I think that is the crux of any sort of interactive narrative, whether it be in gaming and that's a lot of what the future of what people are dealing with in these immersive stories and as well as immersive theater.
But it seems like expressing agency is one thing that people like to do, but another thing that people like to do is to show off how much they know about their favorite movies and things. And that's kind of the whole thing with this world, I think. I don't know, Peter, what do you think about that?
I think it's cool. And I think that I think you're both right. And so, like I said at the beginning, the part of the OASIS that Ready Player One really stretches out and luxuriates in, and that the movie treats almost exclusively, is the the book does almost exclusively, is the reenactment portion. But unscripted, whether it is an immersive theatrical experience using AI as characters like Kent is talking about, or more of a free-form, objective-based thing. It's not something you'd call multiplayer gaming, but structured social experiences would be the other way. So the OASIS ostensibly has both of those, but the Easter egg hunt is predicated on the origin myth of its creator. So it kind of understandably is like that. That doesn't mean I don't have issues with it, but I think that is an easy way to explain away like why the vision had that, but not this other stuff. Which is not to say that Ernest Cline was even concerning himself with kind of thinking that far ahead. We didn't even really have VR in that way. It's a much more difficult thing to kind of suss out as it's coming towards us. But the work of some really kind of incredible researchers and creators and would-be architects in the first 5 years of VR have kind of made giant strides in figuring things out and testing things and tapping potentials. And so, we're going forward in a pretty broad-based way. I think that the dividing line is between what is diversionary entertainment, what is just purely recreational, what is something that has more of an emotional core, and what is something that is predicated on a true authenticated interpersonal experience. So I think you're looking at kind of three things. One, where it's strictly kind of gaming, participatory. Two, where you are allowing a kind of large scale AI infrastructure to give you a combination of that and whatever else. And three is something that's based much more on being in a space with a real person. What that's leaving out is the other part that Kent said, which is really an interesting point that I don't want to get swept away, is the things that can be most emotionally moving can be things that happen in solitude, and are about your relationship with yourself. And, these kind of incredible, emotionally intense moments that come through mindfulness and meditation or things like that. And sometimes those can be shared with another person. Sometimes those can be experienced on one's own. And so that's another kind of avenue of this. This is a distinct thing from Kent's allusion to these different kinds of presence, but it's things that these different kinds of presence kind of all come together to enable in a in a kind of properly structured, properly comfortable and stable VR environment.
Well, let's talk a little bit more just about the specifics of this movie, because Carol, you said that you loved the book, right? Would you say
Yes.
that you loved the movie?
I wanted to love the movie. I thought it took, I did. I thought that, it was a very good movie. It was very entertaining. I wish it had actually talked more about the horrible world, the dystopian reality that everyone was living in. It really kind of brushed that aside, but people are really suffering in this world. There's food shortages, there's overcrowding, there's a lack of resources, the environment is suffering. I mean, there's a lot of intense things going on in the background of this book that we don't get in the movie. So,
and that tends to be kind of boiled down to basically the debtor's prison that IOI has set up that seems to kind of stand in for all the terrible dystopian stuff that's going on the outside, is this idea that this kind of predatory company is allowing you to rack up debt and then putting you in VR to work off your debt to this corporate monolith.
But I did like that in the book, it was Parzival, it was Wade who had himself turned into an indentured servant just to get access to IOI. In the film, I thought it was a better choice. It gives Artemis was the one who did this, and I think it gives Artemis more character.
I liked the fact that it was Artemis, but I felt like in the book it was much more plausible that he went in there with a plan and he had all these secret passwords and backdoors and things for how he was going to infiltrate their system and everything. Whereas in the movie, she just kind of like runs around and hides behind chairs, and it felt much more difficult to believe.
David, you didn't think it was plausible that Nolan Sorrento would have his password on a Post-it note when it wasn't even like a random string of characters? It's the kind of weak password that so many people have. I mean, I get that it's a punchline, but like the fact that the entire infiltration and kind of spoofing his environment boiled down to remembering what his password was because it was on a Post-it note. I was like, come on, let's not do this. Let's have a more creative way in.
That's kind of like Mulder in the X-Files password being trust no one.
Exactly.
I thought there was a weird inconsistency to the dystopianism in this world building because you have, this corporation that basically kills people with impunity and has all these indentured servants and everything. But the CEO can still get arrested by the police at the end. I know, Carol, what do you think about that? Did it feel weirdly inconsistent what was dystopian and what wasn't?
A little. First of all, they left out the part where IOI kills the character of Daito. One of the two characters. They're actually in Japan. The Japanese characters, one of them was killed by IOI, and that didn't happen in the film. Which I didn't like. I wanted to see much more IOI evil because at worst they would be giving people seizures and by giving them too many advertisements. But that's just part of it. I mean, they were trying to change the OASIS. They wanted to charge a monthly fee. I mean, right now, the OASIS is completely free. However, that's also in some ways not the case because even though logging in is free, travel is expensive. So I think money wasn't handled very well. We know it's a real problem in both the book and the movie. But what
did you think, Carol, of the bad guy having like a change of heart kind of moment at the end?
Did he really have a change of heart?
Yeah, so there's whatever you want to call it, but yeah, he's clearly in a position where he could shoot Wade, but
right.
is sort of like overpowered by the power of the Easter egg.
Right. Right.
He had his Marcellus Wallace moment. That golden glow fell over his face and he was in trance.
No, I didn't really get a change of heart. I just got a feeling that he knew he lost. That it was just too late. That's the feeling I got. But
I got the feeling that the movie was saying that his like inner gamer came to the surface in that moment, and he the transcendental power of video games.
Yeah, I didn't get that. I just got the fact that Parzival beat him.
Peter, what do you think?
I mean, I know I said it as a joke, but it really did read that way to me. I don't think Spielberg necessarily meant it as a visual reference to the briefcase in Pulp Fiction, but there was this. They shared this quality of kind of awe in the face of grandeur, and just.
Well, that is a Spielberg reference because we've got Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're lucky his face didn't melt.
Well, so Peter, earlier you were mentioning stuff you didn't like about the movie. Could you remind us what didn't you like? What didn't you like about the movie?
What didn't I like about the movie? Let's see. I think that Spielberg has always been great about capturing the wonder of being a bunch of kids on an adventure, right? Starting from E.T., Spielberg has been great about this idea of treating kids as adventurers with agency, right? That and so many people who've been influenced by Spielberg, whether J.J. Abrams or whoever, has kind of taken that note from him. And that is on its face what Ready Player One really is. As you meet the group that becomes known as the High Five, which is Parzival and Daito and Sho and Artemis and H, and as you meet all of them, there's not an adult in the bunch. And so on the face of it, you have this you're reenacting this thing of plucky kids that are out to defeat evil. But once you meet those people, there's really nothing behind it. Once you get over the surprise of H not being who you expected her to be, there's nothing. Once you get to the fact that Samantha, who is in Oasis known as Artemis, is part of a kind of hazily undefined quote revolution that's seeking to find the egg just to keep it from IOI's clutches, there's nothing there. Daito and Sho, you've got one kid who plays a ninja in the Oasis and another kid who likes to be a Shogun warrior in the Oasis, and they take on the form of Gundam. It just felt to me like it was kind of a really clunky deployment of paper-thin Asian cliches. And you didn't get a sense of who these kids were in real life, other than the fact that one is 11. Yay, you're the world's most kick-ass or badass 11-year-old. Like, that to me is not a laugh line. That's just a kind of you are saying the thing that you see and then not ever coming back to this character. And so this was an adventure that is Wade's and Wade's alone, despite the fact that he's surrounded by these people who are all helping him on his journey. But you don't come away thinking of this as like an ensemble adventure, not even a little bit. And that to me is, a failing of something that Spielberg is generally so good at.
The part where Wade tells Samantha that she's still beautiful despite her birthmark, I just found cringe-inducing to an extreme.
Her completely superficial port wine saying that was yes. And he did the thing too. Don't forget, he did the thing where he brushes away her hair and then he strokes her cheek with his manly thumb. It just felt to me, it was a cringer for me, for sure.
Yeah. Just because she has a port wine stain on her face, it doesn't make this actress any less lovely.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I thought they definitely could have done without that. How about Kent? Do you have? What did you think of the movie overall? Did you like it? Did you have criticisms of it?
So the overall, I think the thing that I was really looking for as somebody who's a VR journalist and really exploring the different affordances of VR, the thing that was left out was this depiction of the Oasis as the ultimate like educational system that you can have. And like, if I were to like try to summarize my critiques about the movie, it's that they took everything from the book that was more of making choices and taking action. It's like this young archetypal journey that's the typical sort of Joseph Campbell's monomyth. And I think that it's those elements that are very cinematic and it's very entertaining and very engaging. I just think that that's not kind of like the unique affordances of virtual reality.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I went into this movie with pretty low expectations. I hadn't read the book. I'd heard sort of mixed things about it. And I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a really good time at the movies. But kind of like you're saying, it doesn't do anything new, really. It's cool to see all these video game characters fighting each other. I thought the characters are kind of thin, but I came out of the movie feeling good about loving video games, which is sort of not, it has been sort of, something that's a sentiment that's kind of been badder the past couple of years. But yeah, I agree that there's a lot of missed opportunity here. If you're looking for something that, explores the possibilities of VR or makes a statement about the world or anything like that, you're not going to find it here. This is a sort of an old-fashioned, entertaining family blockbuster and no more than that.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right, I think. Go ahead, Carol.
As Peter said, I think it was Peter who said, Steven Spielberg movies are usually about characters who accomplish things together. It's about a bunch of kids going out and doing things together, and this was very much Wade's story. So it actually, in some ways, didn't feel like a Spielberg movie, which is surprising because these are the kinds of movies he makes and has been making for years. So I wish it could have felt more Steven Spielbergian, but I also kind of missed the just sly geeky references from the book, and the kinds of references that only really deeply geeky people would have gotten. The only real example of that in the film for me was the use of the spell of making, and al nathrak ufas betha dochel pianve. At the very end, you have to say a spell, and it was the spell of making from Excalibur. And in the book, there were just so many references that it was just such a delight to read, referencing Tolkien's Elvish, Highlander, the movie Real Genius, Max Headroom, Electra Woman and Dinah Girl was given a mention, and his password at one point, Wade's password is Crom, strong in his mountain. When I first read it, I just fell over laughing because that's Conan the Barbarian. And so I would have liked more of that, the kind of in-jokes that only a few of us would know, of course.
Yeah. So, Carol, I made a list. These are the things from the book, as far as I remember, that Wade had to really know on his quest. You've got Tomb of Horrors, War Games, Monty Python's Holy Grail, Tempest, the Tempest Arcade, the Atari Game Adventure, Zork, Blade Runner, Black Tiger, Dungeons of Dagerath, and Joust. Now, I have covered science fiction pop culture full time, essentially my entire life. And I can't say I'm even very familiar with Tempest, Black Tiger, or Dungeons of Dagerath. Just to give you an idea of how obscure some of these things are in this book.
Let's put Tempest aside. Tempest was at least a big cabinet arcade game, right? We're talking about the one like looking down the tunnel, the geometric one.
Yeah.
That felt at least like it was out and around. Like that felt like a very mainstream title to me, but I agree with you on the other two.
Yeah.
But I think the 80s, I think it's that time of the emergence of video games. And I think that's the thing that I think from the movie's perspective, it tried to dilute that a little bit by trying to cover all of pop culture. But the focusing just on that time period, I think, is sort of revealing this emergence of these video games into pop culture in a way that really is kind of this new communications medium. When I look at like the history, I look at like the printing press, and I see that was a huge epoch that was able to capture information and knowledge in a new way. And that in some ways I see computers as the equivalent of the printing press, and it's kind of like the printing press of this era. And these computers, they're enabling these video games and expressions of agency and exploration, but it's fundamentally capturing human experience. And so what started with video games is going to continue into the augmented and virtual reality, as well as artificial intelligence. All those things together are creating these experiential technologies. And so I think the fact that Ready Player One was really focusing so heavily on that 80s was really drawing out the birth of a lot of these immersive interactive adventures. And I think that that's what I find so fascinating, is that the Ready Player One is not only going into the history of that computing technology and the gaming, but also kind of projecting out into the future and really telling a story to an audience that could help actually make this happen.
Well, and just the idea... let me just say, well, just the idea that in the Atari game Adventure was the first sort of Easter egg, the first time the game creator put his name in the virtual world, that had real sort of mythical power for me. I mean, I really found that sequence, emotionally powerful, and the idea that just this is something that matters and this is going to be remembered in the future. I don't know, that really worked for me. But sorry, Peter, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think so. The movie had kind of three built-in audiences, and two of them were going to walk away at least a little bit disappointed. It's just a movie that doesn't bear that much scrutiny. So you have the people who are incredibly excited that VR is being depicted in a significant way in a big budget Hollywood experience, something that is going to redeem things like Lawnmower Man and 13th Floor and a decade of kind of VR-based schlock that we had in the 90s when it erupted into pop culture for that first time. And then you have people who just really loved the kind of detail-rich deep dive into 80s gamer and RPG and toy culture in the book. Neither of those was going to get the treatment in the movie that those audiences wanted them to get. Of course, Spielberg isn't going to get into the kind of consequences of what emotional and social presence bring, and of course, he's not going to spend 12 minutes on a joust set piece, right? So, but what it is, and what bears this out, is when I saw this at South by Southwest, and then again back in San Francisco, is this is a movie that people have a good time at. So yeah, I have a lot of quibbles as a member of all three audiences. I have a lot of criticisms about the movie from a kind of VR enthusiast perspective, and from a like the book, loved the meticulous treatment of those 80s text within it. But I have to tell people when they ask me if they should see it, I always say yes, because it's a good time at the movies. That's just what it boils down to. Spielberg wasn't trying to placate either one of those other two audiences, because we all have to admit that we are the niche subsets of the larger movie-going audience. There's a little, there's a couple of, a little bit of red meat in there for both these other two audiences, but Steven Spielberg has always catered to the person who buys a ticket and puts their butt in a seat and sits back to let a grin wash over their face and get lost in the Hot Wheels race, or get lost in the disco dancing zero-G chopsocky scene, or get lost in watching Chucky take out a bunch of IOI mercenaries, a bunch of Sixers. So I think we all know why Spielberg made the choices he did, which means that we're going to be a little dissatisfied 2/3 of the time, but that last third of us, I would imagine we'd all agree that at the end of it, you walk out after 2 hours and 10 minutes or whatever it is, and you're like, yeah, I had an okay time. I'm not going to think back to this movie a lot. I'm not going to remember it lovingly, and I'm not going to get lost in reconstruction discussions with my friends who have also seen it. But it is, it's a 2-hour summer fun movie.
What did you think, Carol? At the end, they say basically that they're enforcing a 2-day-a-week shutdown of the OASIS so that people can get out and live their lives in the real world. What did you think about that?
Well, that was Halliday's suggestion, because the real world is real, and so I think he's taking it I think Wade is taking that literally. I think in terms of a business, it's not the best growth model, making people go out and play, and considering that as we know, the real world is a terrible place, and this is a safer alternative. But in fact, maybe it will help make the world a better place by forcing people to engage in reality more. So I know it happens because of the book. But I wasn't sure that it was the best decision. But then again, I unplug all the time. Here I am, unplugged, not gaming.
That was an experience that I had within virtual reality over the last 4 years, is that the more that I become present within virtual reality, the more that I feel like I'm present in my day-to-day life. And I think that you can sort of think of virtual reality as training wheels to be able to really be fully present to life and living. And that there is going to be people who get completely just lost and escape into virtual worlds. And I think it raises a question of, what is reality? is a virtual experience just as real as an experience that you have in the real world? And I think it gets into these deeper philosophical questions of, the differences between something like, say, reductive materialism, which would say, well, no, actually, you're just getting your senses tricked and fooled. It's not a real experience, and it's just painting pixels on a screen, and, it's not real. But then there's your direct experience of like you feeling that it's real, and it's more of like a transcendental idealist or panpsychic idea, which is just that or an Eastern philosophy idea, which is that our consciousness and our experience is actually fundamental, and that is the most primary thing. And that if you get harassed in a virtual world, that is the equivalent of being harassed in the real world because it feels just as real.
Well, and this is one of the things that bugs me about Hollywood science fiction in particular, is I feel like it's always taken for granted that new technology must have more downsides than the status quo, right? It could never be like, actually, we could create an environment in virtual reality which is just objectively better than, what we are stuck with, and we should do that, and it would be better. And then again, this isn't a movie that's going to grapple with a question like that at all, but we're locking people out of the Oasis on Tuesdays and Fridays kind of thing just sort of seemed dumb to me.
It was facile, yeah.
Yeah, Peter, do you want to expand on that?
I'm sorry. I was just, that was not a very podcast friendly interjection. I was just saying you're absolutely right. It was just kind of a facile move. And that is, I think in the absence of being able to really talk about the whys and the hows, you reduce a thing to kind of a policy line item like that. Like, that's an easy fix. It was those moments where kind of Ready Player One got into Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory type territory, right? That like, let's resolve this tension by coming up with an easy solution, and we'll just move on from there because no one wants to spend too much time worrying about it.
I think the best solution would be to gamify the real world. Like, instead of shutting off the Oasis completely on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you should give people real world quests, like clean up the garbage, plant some trees, and that will give you power-ups in the game. So you can make the world a better place and make the game more fun for the people who do make the world a better place.
Another possible repercussion of this is, by 2045, like everyone has said, you are going to have devices, you're going to have wearables that kind of toggle between or present a continuum of extended reality that may be components of virtual and components that are augmented. And like Kent said, you'll probably be using AR and MR out in the world. And so you can imagine, and a lot of the headsets that you saw were see-through in Ready Player One anyway. That was kind of part of the vision that wasn't explicitly explicated, but it was there. And so there's there are easy ways to gamify real life by using subtle virtual objects, though that kind of opens the same thorny question again, which is, if you're using virtual objects to gamify the real world, is that qualitatively kind of intrinsically a compromise?
Well, and there's also just the whole issue of by 2045 or whatever, are you going to need indentured servants in their little VR cubicles, or is it just AI going to be doing all that stuff? And what is even the point of any of this? I mean, and I want to sort of pick up too on what Ken was saying, that I just feel like there's this sort of privileging of quote unquote reality that, like, I mean, everything is virtual in a sense. There's like photons hitting your retinas, and your brain is constructing a picture of reality. And there just seems to be this just implicit assumption that any technologically mediated relationship with the outside world must be inferior. And it just doesn't seem to me that is necessarily the case. I mean, if the technology is not that great, then obviously that's going to be the case. And that's arguably the situation we're in right now. But in 2045, in 2100 and 2150 I feel like it's the role of science fiction to grapple with questions like that. And it just annoys me that Hollywood science fiction so consistently fails to do that.
Well, as consumption has evolved, digital mediation has changed our entertainment our mediated entertainment from passive consumption to something that is more active and even with multiplayer gaming, social. And so the old arguments of staring dumbly at a box transitioned into staring dumbly at a TV with a ball in it that you were controlling with something in your hand, to spending all your time dumbly staring at a box, talking to people in your headset, which is now transitioning to the hand wringing about living inside a box, which ignores the fact that whether it's AI or real people, you are enacting the same sociological patterns and doing things that can have negative, but can also have pro-social positive effects. And so I totally agree with you that this is a straw man. This is the kind of thing that, as these technologies become more and more culturally ubiquitous, we are going to change what feels like we're going to change this kind of intrinsic denigration of digitally mediated reality as being somehow worse.
I mean, just given the amount of time that you guys, Peter and Kent, have put into virtual reality, I assume you must personally feel, or you must encounter people who feel that this is not just like a sucky version of reality that people should unplug from, most of the time or whatever, that there's some huge promise or potential here.
I don't think either of us would be doing this if we didn't feel that in some way. But Kent, you've got 850 interviews with people in the space. You can certainly speak to that.
Yeah, so I ask everybody at the end of my interviews with them what they think the ultimate potential of VR is. And so there's some fundamental patterns that I think have come out of that. And that if I were to summarize it, it's just that the technology is just a mirror to the human experience, and that any of the ultimate potentials of any of these technologies is just going to amplify our experience of what it means to be human. And if the technology is good enough, then it's actually going to increase our fidelity of our experience as a human. And so as humans, we like to have entertainment, we like to have fun, we like to play and create, and we have a home and family. And so it's going to connect us to our home and family in different ways. We have bodies that need healing. And so medicine and medical VR is a huge thing. We have relationships and partnerships. And so this is something that, Peter's looked into, the future of relationship and intimacy within virtual reality. I think that we're going to be using it in our careers for architecture, engineering, design, any spatial relationships, but also social VR and connecting to our friends. It has educational opportunities for higher educational, travel, spirituality, being able to represent our identity in different ways and be able to embody these different characters, having different virtual goods and resources, and dealing with death and grieving as well. All these different rituals that humans have, I think we're going to start to also have within virtual reality as well. And there's people who also can't travel, or they are sick. And so how can virtual reality actually give them an access to different dimensions of reality that they haven't been able to have access to before? So I think that those are the major domains of human experience that I think when I go through the 800 plus interviews, these are the types of things when I ask people what's the ultimate potential, it tends to land into one of those different buckets.
Okay, so we're running a little short on time, but I did want to give Peter just a chance. Do you have anything you want to add on just the subject of the potential of VR, since you wrote this whole book about it?
I think that it's certainly a lot of stuff that we didn't see in Ready Player One, but that the OASIS starts to hint at. There's kind of an incredible depth of potential in all facets of life, but the way that we feel the things that we do in VR and the way that we remember them, these are memories that are indistinguishable from what we now think of as real life memories. And so, through this sort of, through the liberative kind of plasticity of body that embodiment enables, the fact that, you could pick an avatar that is a human, or you could be in an avatar that has a tail or whatever form you take as an amoeba, and consciousness can effectively be transferred into another body. There was kind of a wonderful feature in the New Yorker last week that got into this territory a little more than I've seen in a kind of consumer magazine up until this point. And it gets into a lot of the research that's been done by people like Mel Slater and Jeremy Bailenson, and these sort of formative researchers. So it's once you start to tap into the possibilities that being embodied in another human or a non-human avatar, then it unlocks this sort of infinite potential for the way we relate to one another, the way we relate to the world around us, the experiences that we have, and how we think about our existence itself, like Kent said. So there is, I don't have answers to these questions. These are all things that are kind of rushing towards us, but in a wonderful way. And I think that while you can make a dystopian story out of anything immersive, what I want to say is more likely, but if we go about this the right way, it's more likely that this is going to be a time of kind of promise and exploration and hopefully enlightenment in a way that we haven't seen before.
Yeah. Okay, so one other thing I want to raise that I think is interesting is, how does the book want us to view James Halliday? How does the movie want us to view James Halliday? And how do we actually personally view James Halliday? And just to give you an idea what I'm getting at here is, in the book it lists James Halliday's 10 favorite directors and 20 favorite authors, all of whom I believe are white men. And there's no implication that there's anything maybe limited about this perspective or anything in the book. I mean, you could say maybe, James Halliday doesn't relate to other people that well, so maybe this is sort of a facet of his characterization, but I don't know if that's the case. But Carol, how do you think the book wants us to feel about him, the movie wants us to feel about him, and how do you actually feel about him as sort of a hero, or how do you view him?
Well, addressing the part where he only likes things written and produced by white men, women have always been involved in geek culture. Women have always been there. A woman wrote The Empire Strikes Back, which is beloved by most people in geek culture. So I think James Halliday just happened to reach for certain types of geek culture. He did go for the popular things to like, but, James Halliday in the book was actually less sympathetic to me than James Halliday in the movie. In the book, he's just this, all-important character who created this quest, but we don't really get a sense of him as a person until the very end when he said reality is real. And that's not really much to go on in terms of character. In the movie, we get a sense that he was stunted in love, and that, gives him just a little bit more sympathy. How I felt about him personally, I think that he was probably autistic, just really devoted to what he liked and didn't know how to reach out. And that makes me sad. I know a lot of people like him. And luckily we know what autism is. We know how to reach people on the spectrum now. So I think there should be more tools for him to reach out, and I'm sad that he didn't use them.
And I think that actually the underpinning of your question is sort of talking about this myth of the individual genius. And I do think it is a bit of a myth, just because we always are in a culture where there's lots of influences and collaboration of the cultivation of culture. And in a lot of ways, there was a similar myth that was assigned to the rise of Palmer Luckey as this individual boy genius who created virtual reality who basically single-handedly brought it back into the mainstream. And I think that ignores the monotonic growth that's been happening in academia for the last, 30, 40 years, as well as all of the research and the money that's been funded by the government, and everything that is actually needed to require to build that. And so this idea that a single individual boy genius or individual man like James Halliday is going to single-handedly build the single most greatest oasis that could ever be imaginable is just ludicrous. I think that the open web and the metaverse that we all want and imagine is going to be built by a very diverse group of people who are co-creating the culture together. And that to personify it, to kind of really personify it into one individual is kind of missing the magic of what the web is and what this open metaverse is.
Peter, what do you think? How are we supposed to view James Halliday?
I think it was impossible to read the book without feeling like Halliday and Wade were the two ways that Ernest Cline sees himself. There's the heroic version that he liked to imagine himself as, being able to put all this knowledge to use. And then there is the one that spent so much time being kind of single-mindedly obsessed with all these formative texts that made it a little difficult for him to connect with other people or the outside world or whatever you want to say. And his other work, whether his spoken word poetry or his follow-up novel Armada, which kind of amplifies the sins of Ready Player One by 1,000, in my opinion, it kind of supports that view. And you lose a little bit of that when you see it as a movie. But I think certainly there is, the same way that closing the Oasis on Tuesdays and Thursdays is just kind of a facile resolution. I think that Halliday saying, what's real is a similar kind of a thing. I think, there are all kinds of little things in the movie that are poking you on the shoulder and saying, hey, the real world is better because it's the real world. And I think that Halliday is kind of made a bit of a patsy in that way. I think it's a little less nuanced than it is in the book, but I think that what it is in the book is kind of depends on you looking at the narrator and the architect as a kind of twin persona for the author.
In Back to the Future 2, if I'm remembering the dates right, they travel from 1985 to 2015. And I saw this cartoon where they travel to the actual 2015. And they're like, all the movies are, Star Wars and Transformers and all the things from the 80s. And Marty says, are you sure this time machine works? And I think there's something really interesting to be said about sort of the cultural hegemony of 80s pop culture that it seems like, this movie should be about, or this story should be about, and doesn't feel like it really is, like it just feels like, I love all the stuff that this movie is, referencing. And I like that it will be, as I said, remembered in the future and everything. But, why are all the top movies rehashes of things that I grew up with? That seems like you have to grapple with the fact that that's not entirely a good and healthy state of affairs.
I actually agree and disagree. I agree that yes, movies are Star Wars, television is Star Trek. We have more comic book television shows that we know what to do with. But geek culture in the 80s was about maybe 2 or 3 dozen movies and a dozen television shows spread out over a decade and longer. So now there are so many shows and movies that it's impossible to keep up with unless you're, a full-time watcher of television. And so even though there's more of the same, there's still so much more of it. And there are some amazingly diverse, interesting stories being told, as opposed to back then. And as far as remakes and reruns, there have been remakes ever since silent films converted to sound.
I think that one point I just want to throw out there is that the cultural production of culture, I think, is very centralized right now. And that what I expect to actually happen is that there's going to be this small communities that are generating their own stories and myths and heroes and rituals and ceremonies and symbols and language and inside jokes. And that's already happening on the web. But if you look at what's been happening on something like VR chat, you have this meme culture, which is the production of their own culture that is generated from within these virtual worlds. And so I think if we already look at what's happening now and project that out in 2045, I think it's going to look a lot more like individual communities coming in together and finding their own sense of cohesion about whatever their shared values are. And they're going to be the ones that are generating that culture. I think the vision of Ready Player One, that you can have a limitless imagination and that the only thing that people are going to want to do is going to the future and rehash culture from the 80s, I think is a little short-sighted as to what actually is happening already, which is that people are creating their own games, their own experiences, their own stories, their own myths, and their own memes, and that the cultures that are generating around that are going to continue to grow and evolve, and that it's not going to look so sort of corporate, culture in the future, but it's going to be, from the people.
I think I fall somewhere in between the two. I mean, what happened with Ready Player One, or what happened with the kind of hegemony of 80s culture now, is that we are in an age of micro audiences and niche targeted shows. Netflix can make a million of these things knowing that they're all going to get a small but devoted audience. Movie studios don't have that luxury. This is a feast or famine thing. So this is why the kind of $20 million movie has disappeared. Either something is shot on a shoestring, or it's made by a boutique studio, or it costs $100 million and has the might of a multinational marketing effort behind it. So what do you do with that? You have to make sure that these big gambles are as insulated from risk as possible. And about the only way to do that is to center them on things that are recognized by a large portion of the movie-going audience. So in an age of fragmentation, the kind of communal experience becomes the centerpiece of so many of these tentpole movies. I think that's why we're looking at this kind of reign of rehashes and adaptations and reboots. But like Kent says, I do think that as we are all shifting into more of a creator mode, the continuation of this fragmentation is going to continue in whether in entertainment industry as a whole or virtual worlds as something a little different, and that's going to be okay. I think that the conceptual shift that needs to happen is for studios to stop thinking about these as global events. If we can start making movies again, that's how you end up with a movie that's not based on something. And it's just kind of, where do you get the Matrix or whatever it is? And I'm not saying that's a fully original idea. It's a bunch of mythologies mashed together, but it still came together in the artful hands of people who told a new story using them. So I haven't written off the entertainment machine entirely, but I do think that as we continue to kind of atomize and have the ability to indulge whatever cultural palette each one of us individually has, whether as a consumer or as part of a creative group by virtue of our activity together, then I think we're going to see some sort of kind of continued attenuation. And I'd rather see that middle ground come back than to continue to just atomize, but I think it could go either way.
Well, so Peter, so you and Angela Watercutter had a piece on Wired that was called something like, okay, we really need to talk about Ready Player One or something like that, that I thought was interesting. And as I remembering it was basically saying that Ready Player One is a sort of pre-Gamergate sort of take on geek culture, which is understandable since it's based on a novel that came out in 2011. But, it doesn't really grapple with a lot of the sort of internet
any of that stuff. Yeah, with the internet scene stuff, with the stuff that happened in the SFF community, with the stuff that happened in the gaming community, with the stuff that happened with ideas of inclusion and representation, both in front of and behind the camera for scripted content. And so this is, there is that kind of frozen in amber sensibility. And that's one of those things that made my reread of Ready Player One feel a little cringier than I'd expected, is because, like you said, there is this absolute myopia of the rest of the world, of anything that's kind of comes out of a different cultural viewpoint or production machine than the things that loomed large over the 80s, which were almost exclusively by white men.
But I feel like Ready Player One, in a way, it's sort of like it's right before geek culture eats the apple or something. It's like this. There was this feeling like people made fun of us for liking this stuff, and now we're gonna take pride in it, and all stick together and be proud of it and announce it and everything. And Ready Player One seems to sort of like capture that moment. And then, then all this other conversations have to be had, and this movie is not having them at all. But
right, and the question is, sorry, I was just going to say, the question is, does going back to that time feel like a relief for people because it was innocent, or does it feel like a relief for people because they have some sort of reactionary sensibility and they just don't want to be bothered with grappling with all of these other issues?
For me, it spoke to Ernest Cline's good character that he did not predict the awfulness of Gamergate.
I think actually if you read through Ready Player One and if you read some of the interactions that the characters are having with each other, they're pretty mean with each other. They're just sort of calling each other names. They're just like really attacking each other. And I think that in gamer culture, there's a certain amount of, expression of agency, making choices, taking action. It's like, it's all about centering yourself into how much control you have. And I think that on the other side of that, though, is empathy and actually really centering yourself in somebody else's experience. And I think that if I were to sort of boil down the Gamergate and in the trolling online, is that the trolls start to use other people's emotions as if it were a game, and because it is digital, it's not real, and so it's just a fun expression of your own free speech. And so there's like this tension between the free speech versus the people who actually want to create safe spaces online, and how do you cultivate the culture to be able to do that? And I think the Twitter has been sort of the forefront of this question, which is the tension of like, can you engineer a system that is able to create a completely safe space for people, or is it always going to be some combination of culture as well as technology? And this is an issue that has been coming up within the VR community because people do go into virtual reality experiences and they are getting harassed. Harassment being defined by people invading their social spaces, they're getting, called different things, and they just are having these interactions that if they were happening in real life, they would classify them as sexual harassment. And Jessica, the Extended Mind, she just released a survey saying that 49% of the 600 total people that she had surveyed, 49% of the women had experienced some form of harassment. And so this is something that is continuing into the virtual reality community, which is how do you both architect a system that is able to prevent some of this stuff, or give tools for people to be able to protect themselves as victims of harassment, whether it's blocking people or muting them or making them invisible, versus the other side of it, which is how do you cultivate a collective culture to be able to create either private or safe spaces for that you can actually generate the culture that you need or want that feels safe. And I think that at the end of the day, I think it's going to be some combination of culture and technology that's going to be required in order to really solve that.
But just the more, because I was thinking about this a lot, because, the Ready Player One book came out in one world, and now the movie is coming out in a completely different cultural landscape. And I don't, it seems like it would be very difficult, that it would put Ernest Cline and Zach Penn, his co-writer, in a difficult position where do you try to retrofit this story to make it relevant? And I don't think you could. I mean, I don't like this story is a product of its time. And like, in order to make it relevant to right now, it seems like you would have to change literally everything about it, in which case, why call it Ready Player One, right? So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think the book speaks to a time when just meeting someone who knew Tolkien's Elvish was enough to make them your automatic best friend.
Yeah.
And we don't have that anymore. I think the proliferation of geek culture has actually brought out some very ugly things about it.
Yep. I don't know. I don't want to really end on that note, but...
Oh, okay. Sorry. I think the proliferation of geek culture is a great thing, except unfortunately, there are some downsides.
Well, I guess I'll just say that. I mean, I think that now there's. I mean, if you're writing in this space, I mean, I think there is now a huge opening for the Ready Player One style movie that does grapple with these things. I don't think Ready Player One could have or should have really been that, but there should now be. The sort of post Ready Player One, post Gamergate, post all this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Like, look,
yes, but by the time it gets made, it'd be outdated.
well, look, I mean, Wreck-It Ralph, which is kind of in some ways, an easy analog for this movie. It harnessed all the IP harnessed a lot of IP from various kind of formative texts in a similar way, but it told an original story, even if it was kind of a usual hero's journey thing. I can certainly imagine a world where the world of pop culture was the backdrop, but it didn't take quite so much of the narrative load. This is a movie that is about pop culture, and pop culture drives it. And that is a really heavy load to shoulder, and not have the movie buckle under the weight of time. Nothing looks as good 10 years later, whatever it is. So I think that there's all kinds of possibility to create new stories that are rooted in geek culture. I just think it's a matter of making it a backdrop and an influence rather than shouldering the narrative burden.
I guess I'll just throw in a plug for a story that I wrote. It's called Save Me Please. So it's Save Me PLZ. And I hadn't really thought about it in years because it was published back in 2007, I think. But as I was just reading Ready Player One, I was kind of like, oh, this really reminds me of sort of a not dark version of my story. You know, my story is much, much darker than Ready Player One in a way that now that I think back on it, sort of prefigures some of the stuff that's happened. So in terms of, you know, like being a gamer and what does it mean to be able to manipulate somebody else's reality and stuff like that. So I don't know. It's free to read on my website if anyone wants to check it out.
What I would say is that, you know, there's the typical Campbell's hero's journey where you're going out on a vast adventure, and that Ready Player One really fits into that typical mold. And what I expect to see is that there's going to be new storytelling structures that are emerging that are more about like a yin archetypal journey and more about centering the experience in your embodied experience or your emotional engagement. And it's going to be much more inner and noetic and very much less cinematic. And so I think that there's going to be another story that is likely exploring kind of the potential of gaming and expressions of agency. And it's going to likely be written as a, like Ready Player One, I think it was very soon after it was written as a book, was sold the movie rights. And so I think there's a bit of like the book being written, almost being architected like as a screenplay cinematically to be translated into a film. And so I think the real magic of VR, though, is not going to be those more cinematic things. It's going to be more community-based, more collaboration, more cooperation, and these things that I think are going to be harder to tell into a story. And I think so that's what I expect, at least, is like I'm less interested in what Ready Player Two is going to look like, or the second version of Ready Player One, and I'm more interested in seeing how the continuation of immersive storytelling has this blending of immersive theater with gaming principles, and how video games and films and embodiment all get added together into this confluence of a new communication medium, and what kind of new stories and experiences that the actual medium of virtual reality can tell.
All right, cool. So how about Carol? Let's get a final thought from Carol. What do you think about the future of Ready Player One?
The future of Ready Player One. Well, unfortunately, it probably will have to address Gamergate for it to be relevant at all, because that is, you know, a sad reality of gaming culture right now, this undercurrent of harassment. But, you know, it doesn't have to be that way. And I'm looking forward to seeing a positive take on people confronting abusers, perhaps, because this happens in reality too. Sometimes when you confront trolls, they recant. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's really remarkable. We see that these people are kind of wounded souls, and they ask for forgiveness, and sometimes they receive it, and you know, there could be understanding, and I'd like to see more of that.
All right, cool. And Peter, final thought?
Well, we already know that there's going to be a Ready Player 2. Ernest Cline has already copped to this. So the question is, what is going to happen in our culture, I think, between now and then? And is this going to feel like a relic when it comes out? I think that this has kind of been great for everyone to get their giant nerdgasm out. And my hope is that moving forward, whether it's in depictions of VR in mass culture or in depictions of geek culture in mass culture, that we can move past the obsession with looking in the rearview mirror and instead look ahead.
All right, well, that is an excellent note to end on. So I think we'll wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Peter Rubin, Carol Pinchefsky, and Kent Bai. So thanks, everyone, so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, David.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Peter Rubin, Carol Pinchefsky, and Kent Bai for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Carl Watson and Manuel Reinhardt, who both just made one-time contributions to the show via PayPal. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.